I'm a bit overwhelmed by the number of people here tonight. It's absolutely staggering, and so I will do my best. And it's always great to be back in Victoria and see some familiar faces. Many of you know that I've worked in Victoria most of my life, and only 4 years ago I moved up to New South Wales. Did the big tree change, which I'm thoroughly enjoying, and the Melbourne traffic, it gets worse every time I come back. But there's great things that happen in Victoria. You know, having lived in another state now and seeing what's happening in early childhood education, I can't help but reflect that in Victoria was where we started the Environmental Ed Network in 1992, I think it was. All right, that was groundbreaking, internationally, groundbreaking. And this is where bush kinders have taken off since 2011, when Wescott Kinder and Doug Fargo started their bush kinder program. So, and there's so much, you might not believe it, but there's a lot more funding and support for early childhood services in Victoria than I see in New South Wales. So you've got a lot of things going for you in Victoria in early childhood education, and I've seen that much more clearly now, having moved interstate. Tonight, what I'd like to do is to try and create an interactive session for you with lots of visuals, so that we have an opportunity to share with each other and build some connections. I think that's very important out of tonight, because sometimes when you're engaged in these different or challenging new nature play type programs, you can feel that you're doing it on your own. So I really encourage you to build some connections with the people around you tonight. And I also want to do some big picture framing tonight, as well as provide you with some practical insights. So I'll try and very much go across those two areas. Big picture in terms of theory and pedagogy and some of the research, but some very practical insights along the way that are going to support you. And I'd also like to preface my comments by saying that going out the gate into the local bushland is not for everybody. Don't feel that you have to do it because it's the thing to do. Every community, every early years community, whether you're in a school, preschool, childcare, playgroup, family daycare, whatever it is, every community is different, and it may not be the right thing for your particular community. But what you can take away from tonight are some of the nature type play things that you can be doing in your centre, in your school, playground, in your backyard if you're in family daycare. All right, can I make that point clear with you? You don't have to do this. Okay, now I did have a bit of a chat to a few people around the room. Can I just get a sense of where people are from? So are there people here from family daycare? You people? Yep, wave at each other, so you need to support each other. Good. People here from long daycare? Yes, quite a few. Okay, people from preschool or kindergarten settings? Yep, quite a few. And people from school settings? A few people. Wow, that's great to have so many primary school people here. That's fantastic. So I will try and make my comments across early years, birth to 8. So that we cover all those and try and be as inclusive as possible across that age range. Now, can I also ask how many people have already started some sort of out the gate bush nature program, whatever you want to call it? Hands up if you've started. Okay. All right. So these are the leaders in this group. Latch on to those people. They're already doing it. And they can provide some leadership around what needs to happen next in your program if you're just thinking about it. Okay, so let's get on with what we're going to talk about tonight. In overview, what I'd like to do, and I think you've all got copies of the notes already, they were emailed out to you. Yep. So we're going to look at nature play as a global movement, linked to Australian contexts and policies. Then we're going to spend some time, some discussions about where you've come from and where you're at in terms of nature play. Then we're going to look at some of the theory and pedagogy that backs up what we're doing and why we're doing it. Then move on to some scenarios that you'll have on your tables for a small group discussion. Then I'm going to introduce you to 2 research projects that are happening at the moment. and there's some practical insights that have come out of those research projects. Then we're going to finish off with some speed dating discussions. You all know what speed dating is, or maybe you're all into Tinder dating. I'm not sure. Okay. I'm recently divorced, so my friends keep telling me I should get into Tinder dating. That's not where I want to go at the moment. Okay, and then we'll finish off with moving forward with questions and resources, okay? So that's the plan for this evening. And I would welcome, if people have particular questions, then perhaps when we have the discussion times, those 3 discussion times, that if we could have some questions from the whole forum at that particular time. Oh, sorry, went too far. Anyone remember this? Yeah. Who's old enough to remember? So when did Loonig do this cartoon? Any ideas? Yeah, 70s. 70s. Wow. Loonig was really concerned that children were spending too much time sitting inside watching the sunrise on the television instead of actually being outside looking at the sunrise. So Loonig was onto this idea about nature play a long time ago. And I always say, you can't keep watching David Attenborough documentaries and understand nature. You've got to be out there. And that's what we need to do with the children that we work with today. So what are the nature play contexts that we might find for children? And these are a diversity of nature play contexts that I've been to over the years. I've had an opportunity to travel through my work over the last decade particularly and seen a lot of different nature play programs that I'm going to share with you so that you get a sense of it's not just what we do in Victoria, it's all over. So you can see that a nature play setting could be the beach at Balnarring Kindergarten, where Karen Anderson is doing fantastic work. On the bottom left there, that's a pocket forest park in Canada, where there's a preschool program operating, no shelter at all, just a forest park that's only a few house blocks in size. The top right, that's a nature reserve in the US, in Cincinnati, where children have a regular program, and there's actually a nature preschool within the nature woodlands area. The bottom right, that's a logging coop in Denmark. So children do nature play in a logging coop. That might be a bit challenging for some, but that's where it is. And in the middle there at the bottom, that's farmland, private farmland, where children at Karindai Preschool do a regular bush program out there, and they spend time in the gullies on the farmland. So many, many different contexts. There's no one type of natural setting it doesn't need to be a pristine setting. There are many different types of settings that can be used for nature play. And I know particularly in the work that's been done in the UK, often in the UK, because it's so built and so populated, then they use very small pockets of remnant vegetation. Just a patch of weeds and a few trees is enough to create a nature play program. So don't feel limited by the context that you might have around you. And then in summary, the sort of physical characteristics of these sorts of spaces. Firstly, that they're spaces that have diverse sensory elements. So if you are looking for a site for a bush kinder program, look at the diverse physical elements and the landscapes. What's there? Are there hills? Are there gullies? Are there slopes? What are the possibilities there? Are there loose materials for children to engage with? The bark and the trees, leaves and things like that. Is there risk and challenge for children? And if not, perhaps how could you incorporate risk and challenge? And I'll give you some examples later in one of the research projects we've been doing. And is there novelty and change? So are there opportunities for children to experience the seasons and growth and life cycles of plants and animals in different ways in that particular setting? And then also we need to look at the local cultural and geographical relevance. And perhaps this might be Indigenous meanings or Indigenous landmarks that are important, or sometimes it might be historical things. I know that when Wescott kindergarten started in the Darebin parklands, there's a strong cultural history there because of the mining and the old mulberry trees and the olive trees that used to be there as well. So there might be some more recent history that's part of the landscape that you're in. So have a look for that too in choosing a site. All these physical things come to mind very readily when we're talking about nature play. But I want to stress with you that it's not just about the physical. We also need to think about the broader context, the various social, cultural elements, the educational elements that come together to create what is a nature play program, whether you call it bush kinder, forest school, forest preschool. There are so many different names that cover this sort of area at the moment. So the most important one there, I think, is the sustained and repeated engagement with natural settings. All right, so bush kinder, for want of a better term, is not just let's go to the park and run around once a term and that's it. That's not bush kinder. What we need to have is sustained and repeated engagement in those natural settings. And if you're in Denmark, in Scandinavia, some of the preschools there, or forest preschools, they're all day, every day in nature. That's what children do. That's their learning environment. And there's very little that happens indoors. It's all outdoors. If you look at it in the UK, it might be half a day a week for a term, or for 6 weeks. That seems to be the model that's happening in the UK. 6 weeks seems to be the magic mark, and you can fit 2 groups of children in a term if you do 2 6-week blocks of visits to a local forest. Or it might be something like is common in Australia, where we typically do a half day a week visiting a nature play space. So there's many different time frames. You've got to do something that works for your particular community and your centre or school. Don't feel that you have to be hemmed in by particular things that have happened in other places. It also needs to be child-led and play-based learning approaches. This is not about teaching lessons outdoors, okay? There's some interesting research articles that have looked at some of the challenges for teachers when they go into nature play settings with play workers, and the teacher comes out with a clipboard for the children to identify all the insects, and the play worker says, no, this is about play. This is about children leading the way. So just be very careful about that tension, particularly people who come from perhaps a more didactic sort of education background. You've got to think about play-based approaches and child-led learning here. We need to think about our images of children, that children are viewed as capable and competent learners, problem solvers and risk takers. And if your image of children comes from that deficit image or a strongly developmental one, children can't do this, children can't do this, they're not capable, then you need to rethink all of that. You need to have positive images of children if you're going into nature play settings, where anything can happen and there's a multitude of possibilities for children to engage in. Communities of caring children, educators and families. And I mention this one because this has come through in some of the research that's been done with programs, where there's a lot of caring and ethic of caring that develops around the nature play program. And it might be an ethic of caring from just holding a branch while somebody walks past and doesn't get flicked in the face. Or it might be the caring of parents who share transport to get children to nature play sites. That can happen too. So there's caring that happens on many different levels, or it might be caring for the plants in that particular venue. And that seems to be very important. An all-encompassing ethic of global sustainability. So that should absolutely be fundamental to what happens in nature play, so that we have minimal impacts on the natural environment, and that it could be anything from doing revegetation in the environment that you're in, or it might be having free lunches as part of your nature play program. So there are a whole range of things that could demonstrate an ethic of sustainability when you're engaged in nature play. We also need to acknowledge Indigenous meanings and worldviews, and there are some bush kinder programs such as the one at Balmarin Kindergarten is doing excellent work in this area. And then we also need to look at the theoretical underpinnings, such as critical and post-humanist perspectives, and I'm going to talk a bit more about those later because they provide a basis for challenging us about what we do in these nature play settings. And we can think about critical eco-pedagogies that question our ways of being in natural settings. That we need to rethink some of the pedagogies that we typically use in early childhood to have a more informed approach with a sustainability ethic that underpins the ways that we interact with children. So I stress all those points because I want to be absolutely clear that this is not just about simply having fun in nature with children. Yes, let's all do nature play and we're going to have fun outdoors. And there's quite a bit of literature that talks about how in early childhood particularly we tend to romanticise children in nature. Isn't it lovely that children are playing in nature? Well, we go back to theorists like Pestalozzi and Froebel and even Steiner to some extent talking about play in nature. It's not about that. We're at a critical time in terms of global sustainability. We can't afford to have these warm fuzzy ideas about children in nature anymore. There needs to be a really solid ethic of sustainability and critical eco-pedagogies that underpin what we do here. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox now, but I just wanted to say that really strongly. So what are the benefits of nature play? You know, why are we doing it? How can you advocate this to parents or other educators who might think that it's really not worthwhile? So the benefits have been long researched, particularly in the UK. There's quite a bit of work being done in the UK and in Scandinavia, and there's been a number of literature reviews done as well. So there's increased confidence and motivation, concentration, increased social, physical, imaginative and language skills for children. That's certainly evident in the programs that have been researched. There's also families and wider community attitudes towards natural places for play and children's risk management can be enhanced. And we've certainly seen that, I keep going back to the work that we did at Wescott originally, where parents were then, after the children had had their nature play program as part of preschool, parents were taking children there on the weekend, they were taking friends and relatives, and they were seeing the value of local parks as nature play spaces for children. Whereas previously they might have thought it was a destination for a barbecue or a picnic, there was a whole new lens that was being put on the natural space for children and their families. And also thinking about teachers and educators and their roles with children, the understandings and relationships with children certainly deepened over the experience of being involved in a bush kinder program at Wescott. And I always remember Doug Farger talking to me about how the whole pace of the program slowed down and there were these deep philosophical conversations with children. And you had time to do that. We get so wrapped up in the busyness of our schools and our preschools and our childcare settings that sometimes just that slowing down and actually talking with children is a wonderful opportunity to better understand where children are at and what interests them and how they're thinking. So also there's sustained shared thinking, child-initiated interactions that happen in those natural spaces, and it's about educators being open and responsive to those possibilities in natural settings. So there's certainly quite a bit of research now that's been built up around why the nature play programs are so important for young children. And I guess the last slide on this particular aspect, I'd say outdoors in nature offers unplanned, unknown, unpredictable encounters, and these are significant provocations for learning. So if you're able to approach nature play in that way and go with the flow with the children, then there's so much learning that can happen in those spaces. And you might be wondering what this child here on the tree is learning about. He was actually driving a digger. So he was practicing his digger driving skills. Can you see the handles that he's holding on to? And he's sitting astride that, that's his digger, and he was digging up all the rocks and things that were down below. Okay. So let's have a look at what's happening internationally. So a bit of visual relief here, if you like. So I've visited Canada several times, and nature play has certainly taken off in Canada in a big way. similar to Australia. Now this one is a school, and you can see the images on the left there, Sue School, which is in Vancouver Island. Have a look at the school playground on the left. What does that invite you to do? Run. Run and run and run until you hit the fence. There's not a lot of loose parts there for engagement with children. But in fact, what is beyond the fence in this particular school is this amazing forest on the right here. So what started as a program there was the children in the first year of school, prep, were going out into the forest. The interesting thing that they did in this particular program was for a primary teacher and an early childhood trained teacher to work together. So every morning that prep group went out into that particular forest, and there was team teaching. So there was so much interaction and sharing between the early childhood trained teacher and the primary teacher in that particular space. And that program is still ongoing at the moment. The other thing that happened in that particular school, once they started that with the prep children and saw the benefits for the children, then that trickled up through the other higher year levels within the primary school. And I spoke to the Year 6 teacher who was saying he was taking his Year 6 students out into that forest for at least an hour every day. And that had so many benefits in terms of not just their outdoor learning, but their indoor learning when they came back into the classroom. So you can have these ripple out effects from running one particular nature play program. You might be interested to know in Canada, in that particular forest, they have a cougar alert system. So it's not snakes over there, it's cougars and bears. Okay. This is another different type of program that's been set up by an individual educator, and she employs a number of people to run preschool programs in pocket parklands in Vancouver. So this parkland area is quite small, it's only about 4 house blocks in size, has these massive trees and foliage and loose parts throughout the parkland area. So this is for preschool children, but they also run after-school programs and holiday programs for older children as well. And that particular program is operating very well, and they've got more people and more children that they can cope with at the moment. There's no shelter in this particular facility, so some people think, well, how do you do nature play programs? You need a building. But this particular one, there is no building at all. So they're outside, whatever the weather is. And the weather, you know, the climate gets pretty extreme in Canada, so children are outside. But I have to remind you that nature play is not about how long children can survive outside, so keep that in mind too. I did see that in one program in one country that I won't name, and I thought it was a bit much that 3-year-olds were being expected to stay outside when the weather really was quite atrocious. Another one to look at, Seattle Children's Play Garden in the United States, in Seattle. And this is a little bit different because it's supported by council and philanthropic donations, but it's a nature play garden, particularly with a focus on inclusion. So children with special needs, and particularly children with special needs and their peers. So they come with their peers, they come with their siblings, and they engage in this nature play space. And it might be during the day, or it might be holidays, it might be weekends. There's a range of different programs that they have for children from age 2 up to age 9. I was particularly taken with can you see the cubby structure on the right there? That's actually a structure that's been created with a space in the middle, so children that have physical mobility issues, they might be on a wheelchair or a walking frame, they can actually get inside that cubby space and participate in vertical gardening. So that's a different way of doing that. If we move on to Japan, Japan has quite a number of forest preschools, but these are all outside what would be the equivalent of our Department of Education. So they're privately set up, privately run and maintained. One that I visited, they'd actually purchased their own land, 7,000 to 8,000 square metres of land, of forest, and they built some small structures there, such as a kitchen and a bathroom and a bit of a shelter, but that was all. And the children came to that forest every day, 3 to 5-year-olds, for the whole day. So it was very much an out in nature, all day, every day program, a bit like the Scandinavian programs. You're getting a sense of the diversity here? There's no one way to do this. This one, Fuss and Go, Nature Kindergarten in Denmark. So this was a kindergarten, a built kindergarten centre, but what they did each year, when the children were turning 6 and they were about to go off to school, they would have a camp for 6 weeks. And it was a camp, I have to add, they didn't sleep overnight, but they would come every day for 6 weeks, and this nature camp was their graduation, marked their graduation from a preschool setting into a school setting at age 6. There was a strong focus on children cooking their own meals over the open fire. So that's another area we can look at in terms of nature play. And the children on the right here are whittling their own knife handles. That was what they did. That was their graduation present, was a knife. Move on a little bit more, closer to home, Papua New Guinea. I was involved in a research project in Papua New Guinea where the children at the school here had a very big open space, lots of grass and some trees. That was their outdoor play space. And beyond ball games, there wasn't a lot of opportunity for children to engage in a range of different play experiences. So we worked over there for 3 weeks with that local community, with the teachers, to develop the playground a bit more. So we used a lot of recycled or repurposed materials, such as the tyres there, but we also used a range of natural materials, whether it was logs and planting, all sorts of other things were part of that as well. The sand in particular down the bottom there in the middle, that was a feature because these children didn't go to the beach. It was not a safe place to be. So the beach was 3 hours away, and this sand had to be trucked from the other side of Papua New Guinea. It was a day in a truck to get the sand there. The first day we opened the sand pit, there were 50 children in the sand pit. It's pretty amazing. And closer to home, Yarralee Street Preschool in Alphington, where Stephanie Willey is the director there. They've been using the Darebin parklands, going for walks along the Darebin Creek for their regular program, which operates with children aged 4, and also there's a 3-year-old group. So they're going out every day, not every day, once a week, into that particular space. And I particularly want to highlight with you the image on the right here, that nature play can also be about taking action. And if there are particular environmental issues that you see in the space that you're using, then that can be a leverage point for beginning some work with children around civic action and change for sustainable practices in your local park or wherever it might be that you're engaged in nature play. So lots of possibilities there. And slightly different again, I just want to make a mention of this. This is the Outdoor Connections program, which is run in New South Wales on the south coast. And it's Amanda Lloyd who's done her research work in nature play and schools. She's been working, setting up this program where children in school holidays and after school have opportunities for nature play. So it's a rethink of the school holiday program idea, but doing it as nature play. And that's just started in the last 12 months. And then of course we have places like, well, you well know the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne and the Children's Garden, I hope. I used to work there at one stage, and it's a very special part of my professional career. But then you've got places like Kings Park, Naturescape. If you ever visit Perth, go and have a look at the Naturescape there. It's amazing. And then also more recently, Sydney's caught up with Melbourne here. We've finally got Wild Play, in Centennial Parklands in Sydney. This only opened a few months ago, and it was very, very busy the day I was there with so many children and families. What sparked my interest most was that there were no parents looking at mobile phones or iPads. They were all busy interacting with their children, because it was a space where children did need to have their parents handy. There were particular risks and challenges there, and parents, I think, were alert to that. So they weren't looking at mobile phones, they were watching their children and interacting with their children, which was great to see. All right, that's the pictures of the sort of international travel log, if you like. Many variations on a theme. No one way to do this. And I hope there might be some ideas in there that have sparked things that you might be able to do in the particular settings that you're in. I'd now like to move on to look at what we're doing in Australian context particularly, and how this links to some of the policies and curriculum frameworks that we work within in Australia across early childhood services and schools. Now, there are many forest preschool, bush kinder, nature playgroup type programs in Victoria. As I said before, this is where it's all started. The Kids in Nature Network did a survey about 12 months ago. We're waiting on the report to come out, but the report essentially says that there are about 360 programs, nature play programs for children birth to 12 in Victoria at the moment, at the time that survey was done. So that's leading Australia in terms of nature play programs. And we're hoping that that survey will be repeated in New South Wales, because at the moment we think there's about 100 nature play type programs, but we're not absolutely sure. The other thing to mention here is that of the programs that they identified in the Kids in Nature survey, about 85% of them were being run by early childhood services. So anyone who's from an early childhood centre, give yourself a pat on the back, because you are leading the way in this work. This is amazing stuff. And you're challenging those boundaries and challenging that thinking about, you know, how the children play and where the children play, and you're taking communities along with you, families and everybody else. So I think it's fantastic that early childhood services are leading the way there. In terms of support for people that are engaged in nature play programs in Victoria, the Early Childhood Outdoor Learning Network, ECOLN, that was established a couple of years ago now, and that group has gone from strength to strength. They now have a regular conference day each year. That's coming up in April, and usually it's sold out very quickly. So keep that in mind. It's on at the Botanic Gardens. I think it's the April the 21st from memory. And similar in New South Wales, there is also now a network, the New South Wales Early Years Nature Connection Group. So that's a group similar to the Victorian group, and that's supporting people like yourselves that are out there doing nature play programs and wanting to talk to other people that are doing similar things. And those groups are really good to go to in terms of practicalities. If there are particular things that you're not sure about, then have a look at the Victorian group's website in particular. There's lots of information there that can support you. I've got the website details later on these slides. And in terms of training, at the moment, the Early Years Bush Connections training program that's being run at Sydney TAFE, that's been going for a number of years now. And that's a program over a couple of days that's run in Centennial Parklands in Sydney. And I know that the ECOLN group is trying to set up some sort of training program in Victoria as well. So that may happen shortly. And there are a range of other independent trainers around bush kinder that are coming to Australia, particularly using the UK training models as well. So there is training and there is support around if you know where to look for these things. Just simply, often you need to Google nature play or nature kindergarten or forest preschool, and you'll certainly find something. I want to move on now to looking at some of the policies that we work within to make clear the links with nature play, because this is something that you need to do if you're developing a new nature play program and you need to justify this program to parents, to managers, to local government, to a children's services advisor, whoever it might be, then you need to demonstrate how this links in with the particular curricula and policies that you might be working under. So we have the Early Years Learning Framework nationally, and we also have the Victorian Early Years Learning and Development Framework. And I'm sure you appreciate the difference between the two in that the EYLF is birth to 5 and the VEYLDF in the Forward Thinking Victoria is birth to 8, so that we have more play-based approaches across birth to 8. But the learning outcomes for children are exactly the same across those two documents. I think what tends to happen when we look at these learning outcomes in terms of nature play is we focus on outcome number 2 that I highlighted there. I wonder if that's where most people's thinking goes to. Outcome number 2? No? That's terrific. Because what we need to understand is that nature play goes across all of these learning outcomes. That if we're talking about children having a strong sense of identity, if you look at the detail around that, it's about children having agency, about decision making, about risk management. That's what we're doing in nature play. So it links clearly to outcome 1. I don't need to explain outcome 2. Outcome 3, well-being. There's a lot of literature that connects being in green spaces with mental health and physical health as well. So there's a strong well-being connection there. Children are confident and involved learners. If you're using play-based approaches in a setting like a nature play setting, then of course you can see children being confident and involved learners. They're directing the learning, whether it's about the bugs or the plants or how to climb a tree. And they're also effective communicators. And the language seems to come through quite strongly in nature play settings because you've got a whole different setting and many different provocations for children's language and those sustained conversations with educators that all build those language skills in the children. So very strongly in the EYLF and the VEYLDF, those learning outcomes are addressed in nature play. And it's up to you to make those observations of children's learning in those spaces to identify how those outcomes are being achieved. I'd also comment on the practice principles in the VEYLDF. These are the principles that guide us in the work we do as educators and teachers. And these practice principles, I think, link very clearly to what we can be doing in our nature play programs. I want to highlight particularly the first one, reflective practice. Reflective practice is something that's not done particularly well, according to a CEQA. You might recall that QA1 in the National Quality Standard is one of the standards that is not well addressed by early childhood educators, and there's a problem there. And one of the areas within QA1, which is about educational programs and practice, one of the areas in that is critical reflection. So we do need to engage more effectively in critical reflection about what we do, why we do it, and how we do it. And we need to engage in that with other educators as well. So we need to think critically here in nature play programs, and we need to challenge the norms. That's what we're doing here. And I'll come back to that point again when we talk about critical theory a little bit later. We also need to engage in partnerships with families, and that's certainly happening in the nature play programs where we work with families to help them understand what nature play is about, and we build a community of people that are engaged in nature play and supporting children in nature play. One of the interesting things that came out of the work at Wescott was that there were more fathers that were getting involved in nature play. While some fathers might have felt uncomfortable being in a typical early childhood setting, you take them to a nature play setting where they can climb trees with their children, then suddenly they see a role for themselves and are able to be part of the program. Or fathers that come in and cook on a camper stove or something like that. So it's another way of building those partnerships with families. High expectations for every child is another practice principle. So we're promoting children's agency and challenge in high expectations. We're also demonstrating respectful relationships and responsive engagement. And I particularly mention in this one because this practice principle, this is aimed at human relationships and human engagement. But if we're talking about nature play, we're also talking about the physical space, the natural environment. So we need to demonstrate respectful non-human relationships too, how we relate to the animals and plants that are part of the natural settings that we use. So it's not just about humans as it's spelled out in the VYLDF. And similar, the next principle around equity and diversity, that we promote equity for all species. It's not just about equity based on culture or religion or gender. This is about equity for all species and the plants and animals that we connect with in our nature play programs. Assessment for learning and development. I think we need to rethink some of the assessment approaches in new contexts. And this comes through very strongly when you think about it. As educators, whatever setting you're in, working with children, because you're in a fairly controlled setting with children, you might have blocks, you might have books, you might have art materials, and you have some expectations based on your professional knowledge and experience about what you might assess as children's learning in those particular instances. So how high can they build a block building, or what type of level of drawing are they engaged in? But when you take children out into that nature play space, suddenly you think, well, how do I assess the learning here? There's a whole different context here, and you need to be responsive with what's happening and what children are engaged in that natural space. So you don't have the blinkers on anymore about how you're assessing learning. You need to look at learning in a much broader way in a natural play setting. You also need to have integrated teaching and learning approaches in the VYLDF and this is about responding to the context and practicing slow pedagogy. So we do need to have those integrated approaches, but it's about slowing down, and it's also about being responsive to the context. So if something happens in that nature play context, you're going to be responsive to it. You're not going to say, oh dear, the bell's going, we've got to go and do something else now. So it's a different way of thinking about those integrated approaches to teaching and learning and being very responsive and spontaneous. And it really challenges our skills as educators to be able to do that and to seize that teachable moment in nature play spaces. And then we're also able to build partnerships with professionals. And it's been interesting to see how many new partnerships have been developed through nature play programs. Whether it's with park rangers, whether it's with different people in local government, not just people involved in early childhood education. It might be people that run a local community garden. It might be people that run a wildlife rescue service. So there are many different relationships or partnerships that can be developed professionally through a nature play program. Just lost my spot for a moment there. We're nearly up to a conversation part, so hold on, hang with me for a little bit longer, okay? I wanted to mention the Australian curriculum because those of you who have come from school settings, you will be also working to the Australian curriculum as well as the VYLDF. And there are several points in the Australian curriculum that can relate very closely to nature play programs. So there's the general learning capabilities, creative and critical thinking, ethical understanding, personal and social capabilities. All of those things can be practiced and can be worked on in a nature play setting particularly. There are key learning areas like geography, science, health and physical education that can be part of the nature play programs. And then there's the cross-curriculum priorities around sustainability and Indigenous history and cultures. They can come through in nature play programs as well. So for those of you who are in school settings that have to demonstrate how you meet these particular curriculum areas, make sure you document it and demonstrate that this learning is happening when you're out there doing nature play programs with school-aged children. And a point on the regulations in early childhood. I've had a couple of discussions with people already around regulations, and this is an area where Victoria certainly leads the way. The Victorian Education Department has set up some guidelines. There were some initial guidelines that were published a couple of years ago, and now they've recently updated those. These ones were published in late 2017. So if you're interested in understanding how the regulations in early childhood articulate with what you might be doing in a nature play program, then certainly have a look at this particular fact sheet. It talks about site selection and numbers of children and how you can potentially run these programs and be in line with the various regulations that apply in Victoria. So that's an important document to have a look at. The last point I want to make here before we break for some discussion is what I'd refer to as McDonald's nature play programs. And I just want to add a bit of caution here in that nature play programs are socially constructed in cultural, political, social and physical landscapes. They're variations on a theme and there's no one right way to do them. So we can certainly share our stories, which we'll be doing in a moment, but what we need to do is to learn from each other about different ways of doing nature play programs. There is not one recipe that you can follow that will create a nature play program for your particular community, whatever age group of children that you're working with. And one of the concerns that's been raised in the United Kingdom with the nature play programs there, Mark Leather has written an interesting critique of forest school programs in the UK, and he really strongly argues that in the UK, because they now have a forest school association which focuses on the qualifications that you need to run a forest school program and the specific skills that you need, you know, the tying ropes and lighting fires and all those sorts of things, and the risk management focus. So he's suggesting that the UK forest schools have become very much a marketed commodity with quite stringent training. Now, not everybody might agree with that, but that's his particular perception as an academic working in the UK in this particular area. So I think this is something we need to be careful about in Australia, that we don't go down this trap, this way of having nature play as something that is marketed. And I know it's sometimes difficult because the media gets on board with nature play programs. Here's a great photo opportunity and really tries to sell it. But we've got to be very careful about how we do this in Australia and how we translate it. And I think there's an analogy here to the Reggio programs. Do you remember when Reggio programs first came to Australia? Well, you know, next great thing, everybody's doing Reggio, we can translate it from the middle of Italy to Australia. Suddenly we woke up and thought, no, it's a very different context here, we need to do something different. And we need to look very carefully at it, and that's what I'm suggesting we do here. And I'll just share with you one last example. I was having some conversations with a preschool in New South Wales that were keen to set up a nature play program. And the director thought she'd contact a particular organisation that works in nature play areas. They quoted this preschool director $15,000 to set up a nature play program. Now, to me, that's marketing nature play as a commodity. And I think we need to try and avoid this because it needs to be, in your particular location, it needs to be grassroots, it needs to be community building, and it's a shared responsibility for people, educators, management, parents, whoever is part of your particular community. I think that's the value in nature play, not buying nature play as a commodity off a shelf. Here you are, this is how you do your nature play program. So, okay, I hope I've made that very clear.
Yes. Yes.
All right. So, I've talked enough. My voice is starting to run out. So, time for me to have some discussions. Some roundtable discussions, and I'd like you to focus on your stories. And this is where you start to begin to build some of those networks with the people around your table. Your own nature play experience with children and families, and what is your professional story in nature play so far. And for some educators in other levels, that can be a bit challenging. So it's about rethinking some of the philosophies that you have about education and children's learning. So let's move on a little bit here. We're going to talk about exploring theory and pedagogy. And I included this because I really am trying to hit home the message with you that it's not just about nature play, having fun outside, that we need to think about what are the theories and what are the pedagogies that are important when we engage with children in nature play. And two particular theoretical perspectives that I'll mention is critical and posthumanist theory perspectives, and also pedagogies linked to that. We question our ways of being in nature settings. If you're not a theory person, you can switch off for the next 5 minutes if you like, but if you're right into theory, then get in there with 2 feet. If the theory doesn't make sense to you, I think it will make sense when we have some discussions on our tables with some scenarios in a little while, so just bear with me. So critical theory. What's this teacher saying to the children? I expect you all to be independent, innovative, critical thinkers who will do exactly as I say. Right. Are we promoting critical thinkers in children, if that's the approach we take? So, as educators, we also need to be critical thinkers, and we need to question what we're doing and why we're doing it. Particularly in the early childhood area, we have a curriculum framework document. It requires interpretation and it requires critical reflection. It's not a recipe that we follow to create play programs for children. So we do need to be critically reflective thinkers, and I keep hearing a CEQA and QA1 in the back of my mind, so this is what we need to do. And for a bit of a quote about what this is about, we're talking about a new problem or situation cannot be handled with the old theoretical means. So critical theory, what it does is it asks us to interrogate our values, identify contradictions between theory and practice, question power relationships, and promote ethically informed action. It's not enough for educators, whatever level you're working at, to say, well, we do it this way because we always do it this way. That's not enough. We need to critically reflect on what we're doing and why we're doing it. And this really comes to the fore if you're trying to develop a nature play program and you haven't necessarily got your whole team on board with you. So you need to be able to articulate why you're doing what you are proposing, why you want to do that. So a critical perspective actually invites you to ask questions. And I've adapted these from Glenn McNaughton's work. Some of you may know of Glenn McNaughton's work at Melbourne University over many years. So we could ask, how have I come to do things this way in Bush Kinder? Why do I do it this way in Bush Kinder? Why do I set up the way we run our program in a particular way? How have I come to understand nature relationships and sustainability this way? And this is a particular point that I try and hit home with, is that sometimes people think, well, yes, we're doing nature play, therefore we're doing sustainability. And it doesn't work like that. You need to really understand the nexus between those two things and engage in nature play in ways that actually broaden those global sustainability worldviews and demonstrate an ethic of sustainability. For example, one of the nature play programs I went to, not in Australia but overseas, and a teacher was trying to set up the toilet facility for the children, and she found a nice flat spot, but it had a fern growing in the middle of it, so she pulled the fern out of the ground. Now, as an Australian, I was absolutely staggered about that. But to me, yes, you can set up your little toilet facility wherever you like, but you don't go pulling ferns out of the ground in front of children. That's not a sustainable ethic. That's not caring and respect for the plants that are in that environment. So make sure you're doing that. So how many other ways are there to pedagogically engage and to construct sustainable views with children? Are we challenging children about the way we do things and why we do things in our natural settings? And we're thinking about who benefits and who is marginalised by the way I work in Bush Kinder. And I know when Glenda McNaughton was working in this area, she was very much on about gender equity, and she was talking about humans here. But if you take a different lens on this in nature play, we're talking about the non-human, the plants and the animals as well. So who benefits and who is marginalised in terms of the plants and animals, not just the humans, in the environments where we're conducting nature play programs. And I'm sure that fern that was pulled out of the ground was certainly marginalised in that particular context. And what theories shape my work? What ethical stance? Which are useful and what other theories could I employ? So you might look at systems theory, you might look at eco-psychology ideas. There are a range of different possibilities in terms of informing nature play programs. So critical theory is an important one. And the other one that's come to the fore recently is posthumanist perspective. Hands up if anyone's heard of this before. A couple of people? Yeah? Okay. It's a little bit out there. When I first came across it, I thought, we're human, how could we possibly be post-human? I really wasn't quite sure. But when I started reading more about it, I began to understand that it was about thinking differently about what it means about nature, as well as what it means to be a human and how humans are in nature, and it's the ethical relationships between humans and nature. So what it's doing in posthumanism is really shifting away from nature is the resource and humans are here to use all those natural resources and dominate the natural environment. What we're trying to do is to see humans in nature and what's referred to as common worlds, so that humans and nature are combined, entangled and enmeshed, and we can't really keep separating out the two. That's not going to lead to global sustainability if we keep separating out the two and treating nature just as a resource. I thought you might enjoy this particular image, typical posthumanist. Can you see that there's actually a person in there? So what I'm trying to convey there is that idea of common worlds, nature and humans not being separate but being totally enmeshed and entangled. And what we're trying to do in our work with children in nature play programs is to demonstrate in the way that we talk about the natural environment, the way that we interact with the plants and animals, that we understand that entangled concept in nature play. So it's an opportunity. Posthumanism provides an opportunity for educators to challenge and to reflect on how we portray human and non-human relationships. Do we see human needs as superseding the needs of all other species? Can we question the anthropocentric view that humans dominate, control nature as a resource? And how can we practice a relational ethic with human and non-human species? And one of the best examples I have for early childhood educators there that encapsulates that is what I refer to as the ethics of picking plants. Children pick plants, don't they, on a regular basis to decorate their sandcastles or their mud pies or whatever they're making. But do you actually take time to discuss with children the ethics of that picking? What do you pick? How do you pick? When do you pick? Are there centres that perhaps would only have one day where they would pick plants from the garden? Or maybe they have a rule that you only use natural materials from the ground that have already fallen off trees, and that you don't actually pick anything out of respect for the non-human plants that are in your environment. Now that might sound a bit waffly and extreme to some people, but that's about ethical relationships with the non-human aspects in our environments. And it's something we need to be particularly careful about in our nature play programs, that we're not going out there ripping things off bushes and pulling branches and all those sorts of things that demonstrate a lack of respect for the non-human elements in our environments. So the ethics of picking is something that you could take away, whether it's into your usual school or early childhood family daycare setting, or whether it's actually out into a nature play program. And to bring those 2 points together around critical theory and around posthumanism, that we urgently need to be thinking critically and differently. And that's required if we're going to move from an epoch that's been defined as the Anthropocene, and that's been defined scientifically as the global epoch which is defined by the impacts of humans on the natural environment, the negative impacts of humans on the natural environment that are threatening our survival into the future. And what we've got an opportunity to do, if we take on these different theoretical ways of thinking, that we can work with children to move towards the Ecocene, which is potentially the next epoch, where we do have those ethical relationships between humans and plants and animals, and we move away from that totally seeing the natural environment as just a resource and nothing else. It's actually our life support system, and I think people don't, perhaps people are coming to grips with it now, but there's still a lot of people that don't understand that. And there's been numerous government reports on what's happening with sustainability and global climate change. And we've got an opportunity in early childhood to work with young children to create a sustainable future for all, and particularly an eco-scene. That's what we're looking for. So if we're going to do that, if we're going to build on critical theory and posthumanism, then we really need to think seriously about what are our pedagogies when we're out there with children. And we need to engage in pedagogical change. And this pedagogical change, it can happen in our nature play settings, most importantly, but it can also happen in our schools, early childhood services and family daycares, etc. And I'm not a lone voice here. There's quite a few people that have been calling for change. These are some authors in the field. Eva Alman-Hantze from Sweden, who talks about this disjuncture between promoting children's stewardship of nature and the need for critical discussion about human relationships with nature and children being vocal participants. So in your interactions with children, open up opportunities to discuss those relationships between humans and plants and humans and animals. And think about those discussions. It's more than just caring for the plants and animals. We need to be actively discussing those challenges. The Kelly and White paper I particularly recommend to you if you're just starting out in Bush Kinder or you've been doing it for a while. That's the most significant piece of research around Bush Kinder programs. It's come from New Zealand and the GARE project. And they talk about the active pedagogical roles of educators and seeing pedagogy as problem solving. So if you're in a natural space with children, you can pose problems about, I wonder why this rusty tin is here. Where's it come from? Or why is the lizard chosen to live in that part in the bush? Why is it there? Or what are those markings on the tree about? There's a problem here, let's open it up for discussion. There may be many different perspectives. Leanne Grogan's work, her master's thesis she's at La Trobe University Bendigo campus, and she talked about education for sustainability being in the shadows in our nature play programs. And it shouldn't be in the shadows, it should be front and centre in what we do in those nature play programs. And lastly, Africa Taylor's work, where a lot of the posthumanist thinking in early childhood has come from. And she talks about new pedagogies attending to children's relational ethics, in placement in commonwealths and collective inquiry. So there's some real challenges there around our pedagogies that we need to think about. And each table has at least 2, possibly 3 scenarios on a piece of A4 paper, and it will have a colour photograph on it as well. What I'd invite you to do for the next few minutes is to have some discussions on your table. It could be a whole group discussion, or it could be you could separate into 2 or 3 smaller groups around your table to think about the pedagogy. You that might have got a little bit lost in critical theory and posthumanism, you can see what I was meaning when you look at those scenarios. And I have to say all of those scenarios have come from practical experiences I've had in various nature play programs around the world. So these things are happening every day, these situations are arising, and often educators are not jumping in there with some critical pedagogies in terms of challenging what's happening, problem posing, and raising questions with children. And that's what we need to do, to have critical eco-pedagogies with children. So I hope they've been useful for you. I'd like to finish off now by talking about the 2 research projects that I've been involved with recently. and I think there's some good practical insights that come out of these. The two projects were one with Thalgara Environmental Ed Centre, and Environmental Ed Centres are very typical in New South Wales and Queensland, but not so common in Victoria. And they basically run like a primary school, and they have groups of children that come and visit on a day basis or for several overnight camps or something like that. And they run environmental education programs. And also I've been involved in a project with KU Arimba, which is a preschool and children's centre on the New South Wales coast near Gosford, if you know that area, about 100 km north of Sydney. And I'd just like to acknowledge the research teams that have been involved here with these two particular projects. And the Thalgara one had some funding from the University of New England, and KU Children's Services very kindly funded some of the Arimba project work, so that was great to have their support. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a snapshot of these two research projects, and hopefully there's some practical insights to gain from these as well. I can't give you a lot of detail about the research because we're still working through the analysis of all the data that we've got. Okay. Is that okay? Yep. So this is Thalgara Environmental Ed Centre. As I said, it runs like a primary school within the Department of Education in New South Wales. And they have quite a significant bushland area around the building. And there was a woodland area, probably about the size of 2 to 3 tennis courts, open woodland. And this is where the nature play space is being developed. And this all came about through a chance conversation between the principal of the Environmental Ed Centre and myself. And he'd had a few queries from local preschools wanting to bring children out to Thalgara, but wasn't quite sure what to do with the very young children, 4-year-olds. That takes me back about 20 years to starting programs at the Botanic Gardens. What do we do with preschoolers in the Botanic Gardens? So the open woodland area, Matt worked with a number of his staff to create some elements within that woodland area. So things like getting a digger in to dig out a ditch, which ultimately filled up with water and had clay in the bottom, so that became the ephemeral ditch. And later children obviously used the bamboo poles to build bridges over the ditch. There was also a log over the muddy ditch, so there was lots of balancing, lots of fishing, things that happened in that space. These are Year 1, Year 2 school children, and we also work with a preschool group in this particular research. Okay, this is the leaning log. So this is one of the strategically placed logs in the branch fork of another tree here. You can see we've put tan bark underneath for soft fall. All it is a log that's perched in a tree. And children, as they progressed over the 6 weeks that they visited, they went to various levels up and down the log according to where they felt comfortable and where they wanted to create some challenges for themselves. This is the wiggly worm log. So if you're looking for a challenge at a slightly lower level, then the bumps and lumps along this log created opportunities for balancing. That's a preschool child there. Sorry, I'm not sure what's happened with the blank slides here. It didn't look like this when I organised it. Here's the swing. This is called the bone swing. Obvious reasons. But one of the spaces that Matt created in this nature play area was a pit with a mixture of soil and sand in there to keep it friable. And then he had an old cow carcass, bones, that he was able to put in there so the children could dig for the bones in the bone digging pit. But what happened one day was that the children were complaining about the knot in the bottom of the swing, that it was too difficult to sit on. So the children decided that they would get the bone out of the bone pit and tie it onto the swing. So we ended up with the bone swing. So that was one of the most popular pieces of equipment in that whole nature play space, was the bone swing. We also had a couple of areas in this nature play space where Matt was quite creative because there was some concrete plumbing covers that were circular and they looked a bit ugly in this nature play space. So what was done was some old pallets were painted and a pallet was put on top of each of these circular concrete pits. So the pallet then became a place where children could use various loose materials to do some construction or pattern making. So a range of possibilities there to play. And that was just a creative way to cover up those pits that were in this particular space. And of course children finding lots of loose materials in that space because there was a canopy of gum trees, so there were plenty of logs and branches and leaves around that children could work with. So that gives you an idea of what the space was like, and it was an interesting process trying to work out how much you put in that space to create a nature play space and how much you don't put in that space because you don't want it to be too contrived and overdone. So that's an interesting point to think about. If you're creating a nature play space in a school or in an early childhood setting, put enough in there to create a nature play space with enough diversity of opportunities for children, but not so much that it becomes overdone. There's a fine balance there that needs to be worked through. So the sort of questions we were actually asking in this research was what play affordances do children perceive and what appears to characterise their selections and reasoning within the new nature play space that was being developed in the centre. And then we also did a questionnaire with teachers around what they perceived children might be learning and how did they interpret nature play. The theoretical framing, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but Gibson's theory of affordance, social constructionism, UN rights of the child, and a methodology. Any of you are budding HDR, high degree research students, their methodology was mosaic methodology, where you really focus on the children's perspectives and their interpretations of the play space. That's what we were looking for. So we work with children from 3 to 8 years of age across preschool and early years of school. And the children came out to that play space for over a 6-week period, but we only collected data in weeks 5 and 6. And what the children were doing, they were engaged in child-led walking interviews with a researcher. They could do that individually or they could do it in pairs, and we provided them with an iPad. And what we were asking them about was what is the best place to play in this outdoor play space, and could you take a photograph of it? And then we followed that up with focus groups that we ran in the preschool and the school to bring those children together to try and prioritise what were the most popular spaces in that outdoor setting. So if you're setting up a nature play space, you might want to know what was the most popular. Certainly the most popular, the rope swing. Okay? Because it had all those elements there. It had risk, because it was a swing that went in 100 different ways. It had the social elements because you were with other children. And there was a sensory aspect to it as well that was really important. So the rope swing was very popular. The muddy water hole, the next one down, the dirt hill, the trickle hill, the lemon log, and the sand pit with the bones in it. So lots of different opportunities for children. We used to joke in Armidale that there was more mud went through the washing machines at Armidale in those 6 weeks than any other time of the year. And I think the primary school principal said out of 50 parents that were involved, he only got 2 complaints about mud on children's clothes. So that was great. The least popular spaces for the children, we did have a mud kitchen set up, so they didn't see that as the most positive, and yet adults might think that would be a great place. The blocks and rocks on the tables that I showed you pictures of, and the bamboo patch. There was a thicket of bamboo where children often played hiding games or lions and tigers and those sorts of things. And there were some interesting differences between what the teachers saw as most popular and what the children saw as most popular. So you can see there the teachers thought the mud kitchen would be popular, the children thought the mud kitchen was the least popular space for them. So there's a few others there to see as well. Okay. Also, what we noticed as the research progressed over the 6 weeks, that children were using their own names for the different spaces, and I'm sure you've come across this in your programs as well. So the children were thinking that I think my favourite one, the dirt pile. The dirt pile became the mining hill because there was a group of Year 1, Year 2 boys that mined that hill for 6 weeks. Their technological inventions to mine that hill were so significant. The teachers were amazed at the persistence, the concentration of those children and the technological problem solving that they did to mine for gold and fossils and different things in the dirt hill. It was just a pile of dirt. We used a digger. It was the dirt that was left over from creating the ephemeral ditch. You know, it's not rocket science in terms of developing play spaces. And some of the reasoning that children talked about with why they chose those particular play affordances. Obviously enjoyment, but there was certainly a social element and a risk factor, how high could they go, and the physical landscape, whether you could be up and you could be down and you could run around trees, those sorts of physical aspects of the play space. Also being able to manipulate things and the imaginative play that play scenarios developed over the 6 weeks the children were in the space. And certainly the teachers were very positive about this, both the preschool and primary teachers were extremely positive about the experiences that children had. One of the most telling comments from the primary school teacher was, when she's in the playground at school doing yard duty, all the children come to her to solve all their problems, you know, whether it's physical or social or whatever it is. You put those same children and that same primary school teacher in the nature play space, the children take ownership of their own problems. So it was a very different scenario, and that's something I'd like to do some more research on as to what's happening there in that dynamic between the teacher in the primary school, yet doing yard duty, and the teacher in the nature play space with the children. It's very different. Okay, so that just gives you a snapshot of what happened out at Thalgara. If we move on to talking about KU Arimba, so this is the preschool centre. It's actually on the campus of University of Newcastle, their Arimba campus on the coast. And there are a range of contextual things that impacted this particular research project. It was a unique rainforest setting on this particular campus, so the children had access to lakes and ponds and trees and rainforest and pythons in the trees and all sorts of things. It's certainly an iconic area for frogs on the Central Coast because of the climate, and the children were very familiar with those animals. The children were going out every day walking. That's what they do around that campus. So their bush kinder program, if you like, is an everyday thing. For short periods of time, they only go out for about an hour and a half to fit around all the time schedules for the staffing of the centre, but they do go out every day. Babies, 3-year-olds, 4 or 5-year-olds all go out every day. They only go out from March to October because where they are, there are a lot of snakes in the rainforest and around the campus, so they choose carefully the time of year they go out. The director of the centre, Roseanne, she was very keen to be a researcher practitioner, and I'd certainly argue with you that that is a great way to get involved in research, to be a teacher, but also to be a researcher at the same time. And this is what she did. She actually did all the data collection for this while she was working with children. And she implemented a project approach to curriculum, which I'm sure many of you would be familiar with, Katz and Child's project approach that's been around for a long time, an inquiry-based approach to learning that has 3 phases. And also what we wanted to do was a research project that strongly aligned with the philosophy of the centre, the EYF, the NQS, and have some sort of tangible artefact as a result of this project approach that could be used for broader communication in the local area. So what we did was to identify a question. We were interested in the co-constructed conceptual learning that would occur through a project approach and in relation to those artefacts and faults, particularly in that local environment. So it was capitalising on what children knew about their local environment and developing it into a project approach and collecting data along the way. The theoretical framing around social constructionism and interpretive research, and what we were trying to do as a methodology was to create a narrative. You know, project approach lends itself to that because it's got 3 phases. So we were creating a learning journey or a narrative with the children and gathering data along the way. So there were 10 children involved, 4 and 5 years of age, and they worked with the practitioner researcher 2 days per week for 4 weeks to implement that project approach. And what we did was to create video diaries of the pedagogical interactions with the children when they were out on the walks or in the centre. We did focus groups with the children. Then the teacher kept a reflective journal of the work she was doing with the children. She had input from a critical friend who was Anne Pellow, who you may know of, who's an outdoor educator from the States. And then the children were actually creating artefacts and documents out of this project that were part of the project as well. So I only have very sketchy details for you here because we're still writing all this up. But essentially, the 3 phases of the project became what creatures do we notice in our local setting? So what do we notice when we're out there looking at the ponds and the rainforest? And what captured the children's attention was particularly the gambusia fish, which are mosquito fish, and the frogs, the tadpoles that they could see out in the ponds. And there happened to be 2 particular ponds. One was full of gambusia fish and one was full of tadpoles. And I'm not sure if you're aware, gambusia fish are introduced and they eat tadpoles. Alright? So one day the children went out and they found that there was 1 gambusia fish in a tadpole pond. And that wasn't really a good thing. So the children decided that they needed to deal with this, and one way that they suggested was to build a great big wall, a la Trump wall, between the tadpole pond and then gambusia pond. So there were many designs that were developed for the wall between these ponds because they didn't want all the gambusia fish to get into the tadpole pond and eat all the tadpoles. So the project unfolded and it led to some various artefacts that the children created about the gambusia fish and the frogs. And particularly, I was really interested in Roseanne's work with the children because there were 2 key ecological concepts. If we're talking about co-constructed conceptual learning here, the 2 key concepts that came out for the children were belonging and balance. You think about it, 1 gambusia fish in a pond full of tadpoles. We think about belonging and we think about balance. So these were the ideas that came from the children through that project over a 4-week period. And the sorts of artefacts they created, there was a biotopic map, which was a map of the flora and the fauna and the geographical landscape. So that's an interesting thing that you can do with children if you're going out, do some mapping work of what they're seeing. They were doing drawings and plans. They designed some rubbish bins for the local council that would stop birds getting in and taking rubbish out of the bins, and that's all gone off to the local council now. They developed project books. They wrote letters to the university about the problem with rubbish in the waterways. They did 3D constructions and they did their own individual green screen stories about what they were doing and how they felt about rubbish in the ponds, and also the discussions about the gambusia fish and the tadpoles. So there was so much rich learning came out of that project approach that was focused on a locally important animal, and it was done through those walks out into the local environment. So that it's all hung together really well. I now need to find the time to write it all up into something that's comprehensible. And I have to add an extra bonus with this is that I spent some time in the States last year, and this particular project is being now done in the Cincinnati Nature Centre Nature Preschool, and they're doing it just now. And guess what the animal is that they've found in the Nature Centre that's inspiring the children? It's not frogs, but it's closely related. They're newts. So in the US, they're doing a newt curriculum project at the moment. So we're interested to see how the project approach unfolds and that co-construction conceptual learning, sorry I'm losing my voice, in those two very different contexts in the US and here. I think unfortunately we're going to have to forego the speed dating tonight. You'll just have to go home and do Tinder dates instead. But what I was hoping to do was to get you up and moving a bit more and talking about perhaps some of the things that might have provoked you or inspired you tonight, things that other people have said, that you've built some friendships and about nature play. So I'll finish off with some questions and resources. So I think there's still quite a number of key questions around nature play because this area is still emerging in Australia and there's not a lot of research at this stage. So if anyone wants to get engaged in research, then this is an area that needs a lot more work. So we do need to think about how we implement nature play programs in Australia that reflect the way that we work in the early years, our philosophies and pedagogies. We've got to think about how do we manage risk with children in uniquely Australian contexts. We don't have cougars, but we do have snakes and we have spiders and we have dogs in public spaces, so there are different strategies people are using to deal with that. Is specific training essential? And that's the way the UK has gone, but do we need to go that way? Or there are different ways that we can engage with that here. How do we acknowledge and incorporate Indigenous perspectives? And there's some amazing work being done by some bush kinder programs around incorporating Indigenous elders in the programs. So I look to those people to get support in that direction. How do we care for and maintain the natural spaces that we use in the longer term? And this is a particular issue for Australia. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but the Darabin parklands that's being used by quite a number of bush kinders is being quite denuded now. The park ranger thinks it's a fantastic idea because the children keep the weeds down. But are we demonstrating care and respect for our environments if we're doing that? And we've got a particular problem in Australia because we have poor soils and we have low rainfall. We don't have the luxury of all that wonderful forest growth that they have in the Northern Hemisphere. So we've got a particularly unique landscape here that we need to be mindful of when we're developing those nature play programs. And then how do we pedagogically explore beyond that nature stewardship sentiment so that we are working towards ethical worldviews that are going to inform the ecosystem. So there's some questions, I'm sure there's a lot more. In your notes, make sure that you're aware of all the resources that are available internationally and also Australian resources. Boroondara Council has a Protecting Our Bushland Areas guidelines for bush kinder. So I'd particularly have a look at that if you're starting a bush kinder program. And the Early Childhood Outdoor Learning Network is an important network to connect with if you're looking for some support. My last slide. Did we listen? Learning is still telling us no device is needed. Learning's device here is the sky. It doesn't need recharging. It's there. It doesn't have many applications. You know, I don't ever have to recharge my device. It recharges me. And that's what nature play is about, recharging us as educators and recharging children as well. Thank you very much for your participation.